Okay, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar, Modernity Meets Mesopotamia, an Ancient Assyrian Palace in Los Angeles with Dr. Julye Bidmead and Dr. Sargon Donabed. I'm Alexandra, the Executive Director at the nonprofit organization, Assyrian Studies Association. Our mission is to promote the academic study of the Assyrian heritage through supporting research, teaching, and intellectual collaboration among scholars in various fields from around the world. Before we begin this webinar, I would like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Assyrian Foundation of America and iStorage for their support, our generous donors who make programming like this possible, and lastly, would like to thank our attendees for taking this time to joining us today. I would also like to mention that if you have any questions for our speakers, please refer to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be entertained after the presentation as a courtesy to our presenters. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Julye Bidmead is the Director of the Center for Undergraduate Excellence and an Associate Professor in Religious Studies at Chapman University in Orange, California, where she teaches classes such as Deities, Demons and Monsters, Mesopotamian Myths, Genesis and Gender, Religion and Popular Culture, and Deconstructing Hogwarts, Religion, Race, and Gender in Harry Potter. Dr. Bidmead holds a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University and focused on the religions and cultures of ancient Israel, Canaan, and Mesopotamia. She has held supervisory roles at many archaeological digs in Israel, including the Mededu Expedition, Lahav Research Project, and the Jezreel Expedition. Her publications include the Kilu Festival, Religious Continuity, and Royal Legitimation in Mesopotamia, Invest Your Humanity, and numerous articles on Near Eastern religion, ritual studies, magic, and gender. She is currently finishing a manuscript, Recovering Women's Rituals in the Ancient Near East, that explores the role of women's religious and domestic rituals in antiquity. Dr. Sargon Donabed is an associate professor of history at Roger Williams University. He holds a PhD in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations from the University of Toronto and a master's from Canisius College in Anthrozoology and Animal Studies. Dr. Donabed is one of the foremost experts on the perennial history of Assyria-Mesopotamia and its heritage. His recent focus consists of indigenous and marginalized methodologies concerning the development of Assyrian studies as an anti-Orientalist and anti-colonist field, as well as issues of cultural continuity. Most recently, he's also under contract to write a comprehensive history entitled The Assyrians, a cultural history from empire to endangered existence from Cambridge University Press. He's also been a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School and Brown University and lectures in various universities from around the world. Julian Sargon, welcome. Assyrian Studies Association is honored to have you both here today.
Thanks, Alexandra. So I have to start and just say that I am on this roller coaster with everyone here, and I'm really just asking Julye some questions in this conversation because we are extremely excited to have her with us. I just wanted to give everyone a little bit of a background. I became familiar with Julye's work from a ways back now when she wrote her book on the Akitu Festival, which is phenomenal. And after that, of course, I have seen her in a variety of different places, not just online, but she has been on television. Her work is well-renowned all over the world. People know her work, and it's extremely exciting for me. And just to pose this in a larger space for everyone, I do a lot of similar things, and I didn't know until I started going through a lot of Julye's her CV, but also just looking at the classes. I am so thrilled to speak to someone else who is as interested in not just the ancient world and Mesopotamia, but also a lot of pop culture. And I think that's what we're heading to today. So thank you so much, Julye, for being with us. And since we're getting to talk to the Citadel or talk about the Citadel Mall, I remember seeing it when I was a kid, as Julye and I had talked about this earlier. I was enamored with it because I didn't know what to think of it. So of course I have to ask, where did you first, what was your first sort of connection with it? Where did you see it? How did this all work?
That's a great question. And thank you for the introduction. And I am so excited to do this because it was nice of me to meet you and somebody else who's so interested in popular culture and its connections with antiquity and religion and mythology. So that's great. Well, I first encountered the Citadel Outlet Mall when I got my job at Chapman University about 15 years ago when I moved to Southern California. And I'm driving down Highway 5 and my head was turning. Having just studied ancient Mesopotamia and archaeology, I knew I was looking at an Assyrian city and I couldn't understand what it was. So I did a little more research and I went and visited it and realized that it had so much iconography in the ancient Assyrian world. And so immediately when I started teaching my classes in ancient mythology or archaeology, since I'm in Orange, California, it's probably only a 30-minute drive without traffic to the Citadel Mall. I started taking students on field trips there for the last 15 years and finally decided last year that I really wanted to research it more and write an article about it. And so that's where we are today.
And so when you first saw this place, I remember when you and I had this conversation earlier, I remember the first time I saw it, I think it was late at night and we were driving on the highway and I scaled, of course I was a young kid. And of course the same thing caught my eye. And I think I scaled the fence that was in the middle of the highway at the time, which was probably not a smart idea, and went over and started taking pictures of this place. But I had no idea what the background was. I'd never seen it before. I had no sense of sort of the context of this actual place. And I think part of that is the fact that I was just simply excited. As an Assyrian, I was just excited. And as someone who had interest in the ancient world, and as you said, iconography, I can go into the Boston Public Library and I can see some amazing pieces, some designs that are left over from great painters and artists, that they've incorporated into these buildings in the past 200 years. We certainly see that in different places, but what's the background of this place? I mean, it seems so interesting because it is right off the highway. And, how does it work? What was it all about? What's sort of the background about this particular citadel?
Okay, well, great. Well, I've got some slides that I'm going to talk exactly about that. But just to begin with, it wasn't a shopping mall to start with. It was it was a tire factory that was built in the 1920s. And where it's located today in the city of Commerce, right outside of LA, it's quite a built up city, but then it was a very empty industrial area. And they wanted to build a large industrial tire factory. And that's how it started.
So interesting. I always think to myself, I guess I was going to be facetious and say, tires, Dur Sharukin, makes perfect sense, right? So it
no connection.
Yeah. So it's interesting how we get to that. So I'm thrilled to see the slides, and I cheated a little bit. I've seen most of the slides already, but I'm excited to see them again because of the fact that I feel like every time I look at them, I see something else. My pictures as a kid weren't that good, so I know your slides are fantastic. And thinking about where this started, again, as you said, as a tire factory. I mean, was this, did they build the place first and then sort of put on a facade, or did they build it as, the actual castle itself? I mean, I never really understood how that history came about.
Well, the tire factory was called Samson Tire Factory. He started his tire factory in, I think, 1918, calling it Samson Tire Factory. And then when he wanted to expand, that's when he moved over to Commerce and decided, let's build this large tire factory. So he thought that Samson, if you don't know who Samson is, he's the last of the Israelite judges, and he's really well known for strength. Samson, is the strongest character in the Bible. And so I think Schleichler, the builder of the factory, wanted to keep this idea of strength when he built his tire factory. Obviously, he picked the name Samson, and he wanted the tire factory to sort of reflect a Samson and Delilah theme. Though this is a very problematic thing because he did not build it as reflective of an ancient Israelite temple or palace, or even a Philistine temple or palace, which the Samson story, Samson's an Israelite, Delilah's a Philistine, Samson kills the Philistines, but yet they built it on an ancient Assyrian palace. So why did they do this? One of the things is at this time in the 20s, the idea of the ancient Near East, or even the East in general, was sort of conflated together. Anything, whether it be Egyptian or Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Assyrian, ancient Israelite, it was all considered the East, and they put it all together. So looking at it today, it's a little bit Orientalist, thinking that these cultures aren't the same, but Der Shuriken is the citadel or the strength of Sargon. So I don't know if I don't know if the builders of the factory actually knew Assyrian and they knew that's what it meant, but the idea of the Assyrian Empire and strength must have been why they decided to do this rather than an Israelite theme. I don't know.
Interesting. And you know, I always wondered at the time too, how much do we know about the architect? Did anyone have any connection to the ancient Near East at all? Or was this sort of something that just, you know, as you said, is it just all about strength, which does, as you said, it's kind of strange, but also makes sense, I guess, if they're conflating everything. But at the same time, you know, I don't know, I always thought to myself, when I saw it, of course, I thought, maybe this is someone who knows the ancient world, or maybe this is an Assyrian who's building it. You know, maybe the architect was an Assyrian, but neither of those are the case, right?
Well, that was my first thought when I saw this. I thought it had to have some sort of Assyrian heritage influence, but no. The builders that he employed also built other iconic structures around LA. What was used to be called Grauman's Chinese Theater. Some of the other ethnic type buildings, those were the builders that they employed. So I could not find any Assyrian connection. However, in the 20s and 30s, the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago was at that time conducting its excavations on Assyria and Khorsabad. And these blueprints and archaeological reports were becoming known to the public. So they would have had some access to that when they were building it.
Fascinating. Do you have any of those blueprints that we could actually? Fantastic.
I have some the blueprints on the slides of the factory as it was being built. So wonderful.
So that's great. I think that if you want to put up some of the slides, go for it. We can take a look at them. I think one of the most interesting things I remember that I noticed that some of the stuff has definitely changed over time. The pictures that I had shown you, I think, as you said, the color looked a bit different, but these are definitely, I mean, they must have, I guess, created them anew a few times or polished them up or something like that.
They did it. The Citadel Outlet actually went through a series of renovations in the early 2000s. And my pictures, many of them are mine, but many of them also came from internet sources. So just having that said, anyway, this is the Citadel Outlet. For those of you who are not familiar with it, if you're not from Southern California, this is it. This is what it looks like. You can see here, we've got the skyline of Los Angeles in the background of the first picture. And as I said, it's only 10 miles from Los Angeles. And this is what it looks like. This is clearly visible from Highway 5, which is a well-traveled Southern California highway. And as you're driving by, people can see these hybrid human-animal statues, which are known as Lamassu and is a symbol of ancient and modern Assyria. But most people wouldn't know that. And then you can see how big the Citadel outlets here are. Let me move on. This is kind of what it looks like today if you were to stand out in front of the Citadel. And as Sargon was saying, his pictures maybe had a different color. They actually revised it and repainted it and re-upped the color around, I think, 2003 or 4. So you may have seen it a while back and it may not have been as colorful. Interesting about this is that even though it's there on the Los Angeles freeway, and we know now that it's an outlet mall, before It was advertised as an outlet mall when it was sort of in its stages of being from tire factory to mall. There was an interesting LA Times article where they went around and asked locals what they thought it was. And the answers they got were really widespread. Some people thought, as rightly so, it was an abandoned warehouse, which it was. Others thought it had something to do with Disneyland. Obviously, Disneyland's not too far away from this. Most people thought it was some sort of movie set, abandoned movie set. There's some speculation that some movies were filmed there, but I haven't been able to find solid evidence of that. Some other people thought it was an old castle or, a family fun center. So nobody really knew what it was until the sign said Citadel Outlet Mall. And even though it's kind of a Southern California curiosity, it is known all around the world. On an Australian travel website, it describes that you need to go to Los Angeles. And of course, you need to see Hollywood and all those other things, but you have to take a trip to the shopping mall because it's a shrine to contemporary shopping and straight out of ancient Babylon. Well, so that's what that is. And then let me tell you a little about the history, because Sargon asked about the history of it, and I think this is very interesting. As I said earlier, it was a tire factory. And what happened with the tire factory is he decided he wanted to sell wanted to be the largest producers of tires on the West Coast. So they had an opening for the tire factory. And here's the story from the LA Times. When it opened, it was just 10 months before the stock market crashed. And he had this gala opening, just like an ancient king would do when they would open up a new city. There were parades, they had parachute jumpers here. He broke ground on it. His two daughters, who are seen in the front picture here, there he is with, he circled his two daughters. They had a silver pick and a silver axe, and they broke the first clumps of ground on to the tire factory. And it was a big deal. They had local dignitaries, they had radio broadcasts. It was a big deal, and they opened up the tire factory. And here's the picture you asked for. I hope you all can see it on the screen. The top picture are the blueprints from when they were building the tire factory. And as you can see from the pictures that I showed you, it looks very, very similar today, what it's like. And then here's a couple pictures at the bottom of when it was being constructed. The bottom picture, you can see in large letters, Sampson Tire Factory, and then you can see the corner, and it moves in. So these are pictures from the early days of the factory. Here's another picture. I like this picture only because it shows you how large it was. And also, for those of you who are familiar with this area today in LA, it doesn't look anything like this. There's all kinds of things built up around this. But this was an important site. People would look at this and just, what would they be thinking? And kind of that's what's in my mind as I started to research this. And as you can see, it's very large. It's surrounded by a huge wall all the way around the factory. Here's some pictures of it in 1931. Because business dwindled, obviously, after the stock market crash, and Schleicher had to sell his beloved tire factory less than a year after he had opened it. He sold it to US Rubber and Tire. They went ahead and operated it for a while. It operated as a tire factory in some form for about 48 years until 1978, and it was finally abandoned. Then it was a deserted factory, an eyesore. It had broken windows, dusty facades, graffiti, and it sat defunct for a few years and was soon scheduled for demolition. Luckily, this is kind of like a rescue story. The city of Commerce did not want to lose their cultural landmark. What they did then is they filed for it to have historical status. It received historical status. And then in 1983, they purchased it. So as you can see over here, here's a picture of it when it was not built up, when it was ready to be demolished. They purchased it, and then they had in mind that they would do something with it. They envisioned it as a large mixed development mall. Today, it's an outlet mall. There's food courts. There's a casino right next to it. There's a hotel associated with it. There's a lot there. They expanded the original tire factory to 35 acres. And an interesting tidbit, when they were breaking ground on the new mall, Gretchen Schleicher Davis, Schleicher's daughter, one of the first girls that got to break ground on the original tire factory, took the same silver pick and shovel that she used 61 years ago and broke ground on the Citadel Outlets. So the new complex became Citadel Outlet Malls, and it had its grand opening on November 23rd, 1990, just in time for the shopping frenzy and also on our own secular holiday of Black Friday. So they knew what they were doing when they opened this particular thing up. And then, as I said, it went through a number of renovations. Today, this is what you can see. Here's their nod to the tire factory, these two tires on top of the Citadel sign. And they use their tagline, only in Los Angeles can you drive to an Assyrian palace to buy blue jeans and leather goods. So they're really capitalizing on their Assyrian heritage. But I want us to step back a little bit to 3,000 or so years ago. What was it built on? This is a really important thing to think about. And Sargon, you did ask me some questions about this at the beginning, but we need to understand a little bit about Dur-Sharrukin, this ancient city, modern day Khorsabad. This was King Sargon's II palatial complex. He built it in 1713 BCE, and it was the center of Assyrian administration. After he died in 705 BCE, his son and successor, King Sennacherib, abandoned this city and moved his capital city somewhere else. This was a very common thing that they did in antiquity. Every king would have their own particular capital city. What happened then is this magnificent city was abandoned, very much unknown to modern scholars and archaeologists until the 19th century CE, when a French excavator, Paul Bota, he was the French consul at Mosul, he went in search of the city of Nineveh, and he started excavating at this city, which turned out not to be Nineveh, but also turned out to be a very important city. So he began excavating there. 10 years later, his replacement, a guy named Victor Place, he started excavating there. But in summary, the excavations that the French found were amazing. They discovered a royal palace. The palace had over 240 rooms and courtyards, corridors, monumental stone reliefs, as you see here, with royal processions, mythological scenes, figurines, inscriptions. I mean, they found everything you would want to find as an archaeologist at an ancient city. Though some of the colorful facades had faded through time, they were still able to say that these were glazed tiles and there were vibrant paints. One of the most important things they found there are these lamassu. And these figurines, if you're not familiar with them, they have the head of a human, the body of a bull, wings of a bird, and they really signify guardians. They would stand as guardians at the entrances to Assyrian cities. They would stand at the entrances to important rooms to guard the cities as they went along. All right. Quickly, I want to show these pictures because as a historian, I really like looking at illustrations that actually come from the time period that we are talking about. Here is a picture of the illustrations and the excavation. As you can see, they have to destroy in order to excavate. Archaeology is a lot of destruction, but not quite in the modern times, the destruction at this particular level. Here they had to break apart some of the lamassu in order to transport them. As a side note, this wasn't the only excavation that was going on in Assyria at this time. The British were also digging up the land. Here we have Austin Henry Layard and an archaeologist, an Assyrian Iraqi, Hormad Razan, who excavated nearby Nineveh, nearby cities, and they found very, very similar artifacts. They found the Lamassu, the winged genies, the inscriptions, and they were also digging up the land. It became kind of an imperialist contest between the British and the French to see who could get the artifacts back to the British Museum or to the Louvre the fastest. So though they were in competition, they had to work together to be able to get these huge artifacts into Europe. So here's a picture from Layard's excavation of them hoisting the Lamassu. They put it on sleds that were pulled by hundreds of men to get back to the museum. Boda himself was not that careful. We have stories that he actually cut the heads off the Lamassu or broke the ancient reliefs into pictures for easy transport. So you can imagine how hard this would have been. These Lamassu were probably 16 feet high, they measured, and weighed about 40 tons. Trying to move something like that would have been very difficult. So that's why he had to cut them in half, but they made it. As you can see here, they made it to the British Museum, where you can visit this today. You can go see them at the Louvre. You can see them many, many, many different places. Here's one picture of the Assyrian sculpture moving into the British Museum, and this is completely intact. Well, back to the Citadel. Sargon, do you want to ask me any questions? Do you want me to keep going?
No, I just, of course, as you're going through this, I'm thinking to myself, so many things. One, I know that, of course, they're using the symbol of the Lamassu. And on a popular culture note, if anyone's familiar with Brandon Mull's work with the Fablehaven stories, there's a great moment. It's all about fairy tale creatures. And there's a great moment in the last book of the first series where there's a guardian that's standing outside in what's a place called the Hidden Mirage. And it's a Lamassu, and that's exactly what he's doing. Is he's standing guard, sort of protecting this whole area, making sure no one bad is getting in or out, right? Sort of keeping bad folks on either side. Didn't want anyone to cause any issues. And so, it's amazing how many different pieces we see of the Lamassu. But it's not just Lamassu, right? Lamassus are everywhere, but there's other stuff as well, right?
Right. The genie is another thing that is very important that I'm going to talk about. But you're right. The Lamassu is everywhere. The Citadel uses it as their, as their logo. It's everywhere. It's on the parking sign. It's on the Starbucks sign. There are so many of there. And, the question that I have when I'm looking at this is, does the average shopper know what a Lamassu is? Is that problematic that they don't know what it is? So yeah, this is just one of the imagery, but it's so apparent that you can see it everywhere. Back to what you just asked me, what other symbols do we have? And this is another symbol, a religious symbol of a genie. As you can see in this picture, this is one of the reliefs on the western exterior of the Citadel. This is clearly visible from Highway 5. We have King Sargon II in his royal regalia, his hand poised on his sword, being faced by a winged genie. A winged genie is performing some sort of purification or ritual upon the king. These images are widespread through ancient Assyrian mythology. There's all kinds of different genies. There's some that have 4 wings. There's some that have 2 wings. There's some that have fish heads. There's some that have human heads. In this particular one at the Citadel, we see the human-headed genies. Also, as another note, the builders really tried to get this right. And I am impressed with the amount of detail they put into it, but etched across the bottom of the king and the genie are what looks like cuneiform, but it's fake cuneiform. Cuneiform is the language of the language system of the ancient Mesopotamians. This is the script that they would use. So on this slide, you can see this is what's at the Citadel, and of course, most people don't read this. You wouldn't know that it really doesn't say what it should say. On the other side, I've given you just a picture of what the actual relief from Der Sherakin looks like. That's inscribed about the Lamassu and about the King City, and then just another picture to see what cuneiform would have looked like. This is what they were copying, and I think they did a pretty good job. I mean, it's not real, but I think they did a really good job of copying this. And I want to show you a few more pictures before I jump into the religious iconography. So if you're at the western facing wall, you walk a little further towards the center, and then you're at the Citadel Offices. These are the business offices. They were the business offices for the tire factories throughout their time, and they are the business offices today for the Citadel. And there's a picture of me standing in front of this, and you can get an idea of just how tall this building is and the beautiful design that they made on the outside. Across the top is a relief of King Sargon in his royal chariot going off to war. And then all through the rest of the doors, you can see there's a lot of Assyrian imagery, and then the smaller Lamassu guarding the doorways, just like they did in antiquity, guarding the doorways of this. And I think, to me, the doors were just amazing, the way they designed them. Here you see the Rosette Design, which was really popular in ancient Mesopotamia, both Assyrian and Babylonian, used this Rosette Design in quite a bit of artwork. Some say it might be related to the goddess Ishtar. Others say it might have a more evil, repelling quality to it. But either way, it's completely there on the Citadel Offices. But stepping inside the Citadel Offices, which is not something which people would normally do when they're visiting the mall, inside there, the wonders do not cease. It is beautifully decorated. It's a combination of ancient Assyrian design coupled with sort of an Art Deco style that would have been popular in the 20s and 30s. And Dr. Eva Miller, who actually wrote a paper about the Nebraska State Capitol, which also has some Assyrian designs, she rightfully said that the Art Deco designs work really well with the clean lines of Assyrian imagery. And I think she's 100% right there. They work so well together that you would not know you are looking at cultures and designs that are 3,000 years apart. So I really agree with her there. These are just a couple pictures of what it's like inside the offices. You have winged creatures. You also have relief panels of Sargon in his chariots. You also have, here we have a 4-winged genie. Just like the 2-winged genie outside, this 4-winged genie is doing some sort of protection to the warriors that are going off to fight. And then all over it, you can see the specificity of the design. So if you do go to the outlet mall, definitely step into the business offices because you don't want to miss this. All right, let me talk a little bit about the genie and the religious iconography, because that's what I think is the most important part of this. So I was focusing my research only on these 2 figures, the Lamassu and the Genie. And both of these figures functions as apotreic figures in the ancient world. What that means is they were figures that were used to ward off crises, evil, illness, any unspecified evils. They kept the danger away. And they are all throughout all of Mesopotamian history. But the genie is a very, very important one. And we need to think about what ancient religion was like. Certainly polytheistic. And this belief in supernatural forces that could harm or protect you. So not all supernatural forces were evil. There were some that were protective. And this was the role of the Lamassu, and this was the role of the genie. It was taken for granted that these beings would protect you from whatever evil there might be. So it's widespread. You can see them everywhere. The Lamassu, for example, you see the large monumental ones outside of buildings, but then there's smaller ones that you find buried underneath the palaces and temples, often with inscriptions. So to the ancient viewer, they would see this as normal. They would see this as a protective sign. This genie is protecting our kingdom. This genie is protecting us. So here I have a picture of the one from the Citadel Outlet, and then the drawing is an actual drawing from one from ancient Khorsabad. And you can see they have very, very similar design. The builders of the Citadel really worked hard to get this to look almost exactly like the other ones. So the genie are really, really interesting because like I said, to the ancient viewer, they would look normal. To us, modern viewers, they might look fantastical. They might look like creatures. They might look superstitious, but they looked like guardians to the ancients. So a little bit about the genies. As I said, there were several different kinds of genies that they would have, but they all performed the similar function. They would purify or protect something. Here we have the genie holding two items in his hand, and the genies were almost always male. There's some idea there might have been some female ones, but I'm going to stick with this idea, especially because I'm looking at the Citadel ones. These are male. They're holding something like a pine cone in their hand. It's raised up in their hand, and they're holding a bucket in its the other hand. Scholars, as usual, are divided on the function of these two things. Some scholars say that the pine cone was used to fertilize a sacred tree, which lots of other Assyrian imagery, Babylonian imagery has a sacred tree. Others say the cone might have been dipped in some sort of holy water in that bucket, and then that would have been used to purify. Others say the bucket was actually used to collect the evil and take the evil away. Either way, whatever they were used for, they were familiar symbols to antiquity, and they are there in the Citadel Mall. However, this familiarity, this sense of comfort is completely lost at the shopping mall to the modern viewers. So that's our genie. And then a little bit about the Lamassu. The Lamassu, you can find them everywhere. Here's one from the New York, the Met, Metropolitan Museum. As you can see, they are very large. One really curious thing about some of these Lamassu, especially the ones found at Khorsabad and other sites, they seem to have 5 legs. You notice that here? 5 legs, because to be seen from kind of like an ancient 3D, if you look at it from the front, they're standing as guardians. If you look at it from the side, they appear to be trotting or running. So they are meant to be looked at that way. I've heard some people who don't understand this talk about, oh, these creatures always had 5 legs because that's what they had, but it's a design feature so that they can look at it that way. So here is an ancient Lamassu compared to the Lamassu at the Citadel. These are the large ones. These pictures, I must say, are not mine. They were on an internet site, but they do capture the detail and the, just the painstaking amount of work that the builders put into the Lamassu. Now, one thing is that some of them were built when the tire factory was built, but in the 90s and in the 2000s, when the mall was built and then it was being renovated, they built new Lamassu to go along with it. So as a side-by-side picture, here's a picture of the archaeologist and the historians working on the Lamassu at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and a modern picture of them working on the Lamassu at the Citadel. So just so you can see, this is how they worked on them. Now, the question I have is, I could talk so much more about these figures and what they mean and how they functioned in antiquity, but why did the builders pick the Lamassu and the Genie as the figures to really stand out at the mall? Why so much emphasis on that? There are countless other Assyrian images that they could have chose from. Oriental Institute, University of Chicago archaeologists, as I said, were excavating Khorsabad right around the time that the original tire factory was being done. And they came up with representations of reliefs that have military campaigns, scenes from a royal hunt, banquets, kind of some really graphic military scenes. But all of these scenes that they have excavated, to me, seem to reflect the idea of strength and might more so than a lamassu and a genie. So if you saw a picture, a large picture or a relief of a king going to war and the captives being carried away, it might give you a better idea of strength than looking at a winged creature that you don't know what it is, or a genie winged creature that you're not sure what it's doing. And my take on this is that the modern people that built this and in the 20s and then later on in the 90s that re-upped this, like the idea of this sense of otherness, this sense of otherworldliness that these creatures sparked when they were thinking about it. So we don't know really what they did. We don't know why they didn't pick and choose to emphasize some of the other scenes, like as you see here, here's a chariot scene. And then inside the Citadel office and on the top panel, there's a chariot scene. While they did put something there, it's not that much. There isn't a lot to look at. So why did they come up with this? Scholars look at something that's called reception history. And basically what we look at is thinking that people of a same time period kind of have shared ideas about what they're looking at as a reception. I have to look what was happening when they were first excavating ancient Assyria, and these things were coming to light. In the 19th century, archaeology of Mesopotamia was at its heyday. All kinds of artifacts were being found. The Victorian mind was enthralled with these curious discoveries. In 1854, for the world's expedition, the Great Expedition, they built something called the Crystal Palace. Here's some pictures from the Crystal Palace, and they proudly features a Nineveh court. Layard himself wrote a book explaining the Nineveh court, and as you can see, there's lamassu, there's genies, there's everything there that we saw in these excavations. Also at the same time, Neo-Assyrian jewelry and clothing were super popular, as well as orientalizing the biblical scene. So the 19th century, this was there, this was alive in the culture. By the 20s, so we jump a few decades to when the Citadel or the tire factory was being constructed, Mesopotamian imagery was firmly ingrained in the public consciousness. It was there in popular culture. Artifacts were being discovered. Archaeological expeditions were publishing reports. They may not be as accurate as the ones that we look at today, but they were out there. They were systematic. They were being published. Cuneiform languages had been deciphered. We could read most of them. Mesopotamia was part of the popular culture. In fact, here I have this picture of Agatha Christie. If you know anything about Agatha Christie, she met her second husband, archaeologist Max Mallowan, who was excavating among the ruins of Ur. She joined him on many excavations, including Nineveh and Nimrod. And this must have given her fodder for some of her archaeological themed novels like Death in Mesopotamia. At the same time, we had wealthy billionaires and industrial tycoons like William Randolph Hearst and John Rockefeller. They were busy collecting ancient artifacts, both from the Greco-Roman world, but also from the Mesopotamian world. In fact, Rockefeller, funded a wing of the museum and a museum in Israel. So they were very much interested in these artifacts. So this is what was happening in the 20s when they were building the factory. Now we turn to today, and I'm jumping a little bit past the Citadel Outlet because I want to make you aware that the Citadel Outlet was not the only place where you could see Assyrian imagery at a shopping mall. This is the Highland and Hollywood Center, and this is a multi-storied open air shopping mall. And this is described as concrete Babylon. Hollywood's glitziest space and place of consumption. It is a tourist mecca visited by thousands who want a taste of old Hollywood. It was constructed in 2001 as a tribute to silent film era Hollywood, okay? So why did they include Mesopotamian imagery, Assyrian imagery in this? It was based on the set of D.W. Griffith's 1916 silent film, Intolerance. In that film, he had a Babylonian set design. Now, the Babylonian set he had designed is problematic and Oriental in itself because it combines Assyrian, Egyptian, and maybe even Southeast Indian imagery. However, it was the Babylonian set that they designed the Howland and Highland Center. And you can see there the sign here from the mall. Here's the Babylonian court telling us what it's about. The movie, let's see if I have next. Yes, go back to this. The Highland Center has some of the same imagery we've seen at the Citadel. You have the Genie, you have the Lamassu, you have here you have two kinds of Genie, the fish-headed and the eagle wing-eyed Genie, and you have the four and the two-winged, and you also have an Assyrian stylized tree in the middle of it, along with the Rosette Design. So they use the same imagery as this. Why? In 2001, when they built this mall, why did they use the same imagery? Could they be thinking of a decade earlier, only 15 miles away, the success of the Citadel Outlets and its use of Assyrian imagery? Could they be thinking that when they built it? I don't know. It's just speculation. Here is, as I said, the D.W. Griffith set, which really does kind of throw us together in an anything goes Middle Eastern and sort of mindset Oriental fantasy to it. Highland Center, I haven't been there lately, but in July, just last summer, the crews began dismantling the Babylonian imagery. As you can see here, we have the elephants being destroyed. What happened is Los Angeles have complained a lot about the racist heritage of D.W. Griffith, especially, you know, the birth of the nation, and that they did not like to see, you know, a tribute to D.W. Griffith, and therefore have long fought to get this removed. And what they're doing is they're removing all of the Babylonian themes, converting it to a modern Art Deco display. It's going to have a new name, Ovation Center. It might already have the new name because I haven't been up there. And it's going to have a $100 million makeover. And here's a quote from one of the new owners. The old design is not relevant for today's consumers. For me, as a historian and as a lover of all things Mesopotamian, it is very difficult to see them destroying these images. So could this happen to the Citadel? And that's the question that I'm thinking of. You know, our 21st century sensibilities tell us that this is cultural appropriation, taking a foreign culture, throwing it all together. There's Orientalism, there's colonialism behind these ancient artifacts. Should we be using these imageries in today's culture? There are no easy answers for this. And, you know, again, should the Citadel be changed? Should it be torn down and have something that reflects America as it is today? My suggestion is, no, we should keep it as it is. I think with the Citadel Outlets, what would make this great is to have an explanation of the Assyrian imagery. It would lessen the sort of blatant appropriation of a foreign culture. They could have plaques with QR codes at key points in the mall, that the QR code would go to their website, and they could have a short, unbiased history explanation of what these symbols are and what they represent. That would lessen, I think, the sort of otherness and the exoticness of this. It wouldn't necessarily be something other from a pagan, long lost religion, but it would act as a learning tool, and it would be an integral component of the ancient world and what the ancient world was like. And that would give the ordinary spectator, a sense of cultural context, and they would learn something for it. So I don't know, the question is to be asked, why did they use these imageries? Is it colonialism? Is it Orientalism? Is it appropriation? I want to think that, a very non-intellectual stance, that the inclusion of these Assyrian images and elements in these public buildings in the 1920s and 30s was done out of sheer appreciation for these newly discovered wonders. Archaeologist, and I want to end with this quote, and museum curator Paul Collins, he remarks, nearly 3,000 years after their creation, the Assyrian sculptures retain their power to astonish. And I think he's right. The Citadel Outlet demonstrates that even replicas of these ancient artifacts are still astonishing the modern viewer, or basically the modern shopper. So that's kind of my presentation. And I'm happy to answer questions. Here's some pictures taken several years back of my students and I when we go on a field trip to look at it. And I'm looking forward to going to see it again in April with my students and hoping that they will understand this. So let me stop my sharing and entertain some questions, both from Sargon and the audience.
Thank you so much, Julie. When I was looking at those last few and I was hearing your ideas about, this is going to come up, and it has already come up with the issues of not just appropriation, like you said, but again, this issue of intolerance and sort of the racist overtones of the work, but also as you said, the defamation and all those other issues. But what I find to be really interesting is your suggestion, right? Because a lot of times what we have to deal with is, and this is not something new, right? This is not something new. This is the AHA, in fact, actually had an entire discussion about, and it's been going on for a while, but an entire discussion on what to do with Southern monuments, right? Civil War monuments and things like that. Why were they built? When were they built? Now there's in so many cases, there's a very obvious racial overtone, racist overtone, I should say, and support for people that most of that stuff came out of the Daughters of the Confederation, and it was a whole different ballgame. What's interesting about this piece is it seems like if you change, maybe even if you removed some of the stuff, the elephants are very interesting, make me think of Southeast Asia rather than Mesopotamia, of course, but there's this really great sort of avenue of approach, which is to, as you said, to offer this to people to say, well, perhaps we can utilize this in a sense to support this culture that there's this existential threat against it, right? We saw that in 2014 with the movement of ISIS. It continues today. It's happening under the Kurdistan regional government in certain places. We've seen the destruction of artifacts. It happens in other places in Syria, in Iraq, in Turkey. So it's not something new. This stuff has been going on for quite some time. So I wonder, maybe telling the story, but telling the story that, if you go around Los Angeles, for instance, you will encounter Assyrians, right? You will encounter the descendants of this ancient civilization and culture. Imagine how beneficial that would be from the perspective of attempting to right or wrong, if you want to think of it from that perspective. I fully agree with you. I think there's ways in which they can go about doing this without eliminating everything altogether. And it was funny because in one sense, the ancient imagery perhaps saved the citadel.
Yes.
But by the same token, because of the background of the movie, is helping get the other pieces torn down in Hollywood, right? So this sort of this juxtaposition of these two places with similar things. And the only other thing I wanted to add to that, and I'll turn it to Alexandra so she can ask some of the questions, but I as somebody who ends up doing the whole gambit of the Assyrian world, I love the pine cone imagery of the genie, which I know there's a few people that have asked questions about. But the fact that you see this in cultures today, in Christian churches, you typically will see around Easter time, they'll utilize particular like palm leaves frequently, right, and dip it into water and bless people with it. You see that in churches in the East and in the West. But also the fact that for those who are unfamiliar, the actual bucket itself, the thing that they were holding, one of the words for it I thought was interesting. There's a connection with modern Assyrian. The sutla is a typical word that people use for a basket in modern Assyrian as well. So just really interesting connections there. But I know there's a ton of questions, and thank you so much for that phenomenal presentation. Alexander, do you want to go through some of those?
Yes, thank you. No, thank you, Julian Sargon. Just really quickly, personally, when I was a kid, I always remember passing and visiting the Citadel Outlets. It's right off the 5 freeway. So, and I always was wondering as a kid, was this built by Assyrian? What's the whole aspect of it being in Los Angeles? Is this, what's the meaning behind it? And I was also just fascinated by knowing the history behind this. And thank you for bringing up the cultural appropriation aspect of it as well, because, that's very important to bring up and to mention, since our culture is, very ancient and important. So before going into questions, I just wanted to kind of give my little bit of feedback to that. So now we'll move forward with the Q&A portion of this webinar. And I know a lot of people have asked questions, and I'll go ahead and read. I'll try my best to read them. So this one is this site on the National Register of Historic Places? How does this constrain the shopping center's remodeling? Are the Lamassus added recently? So this is kind of a lot of questions, but whoever wants to take this, please go ahead.
Yeah, the Lamassus were added. Some of them were added in, like I said, the early 2000s when they went through renovation. And anything that's on a historical register has to go through getting it's approved, its blueprint. So yes, it would have to have gone through that approval process.
Okay, and do you know who was responsible for the design of the decorative reliefs and their manufacture?
I don't know that. I would imagine the decorative reliefs probably came from the architectural company that built it in the 20s. And I did have that name somewhere, but it's not off the top of my head.
Okay, and Julie, I'm a forester and I am curious about the pine cone symbol in the Citadel Outlets. Is there any relation to the Assyrian tree of life?
Yes, as I said about the pine cone, scholars are always divided, and that's what makes us scholars, so we can have write articles and talk to one another. And as you saw on the tree of life design on the Highland and Hollywood Center, the genie was clearly using that pine cone to fertilize the sacred tree. So there is a lot of talk that the pine cone is used to fertilize this Assyrian stylized sacred tree. And this tree of life is the sacred tree that we see through many, many ancient Near Eastern cultures. Yes, so I think that is possible. However, at the Citadel Outlet Mall, we don't have any of these stylized trees of life, stylized tree. And it looks like they're using the pine cone directly on the king.
Okay, and a lot of pine cones in history reflect the pineal gland. Can you explain how the ancient Assyrians used the pine cones in this reference?
I wish I could explain that, because I don't know really how they did that. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry. Sargon, do you know?
I do not. I mean, I've heard it many times, this discussion of, pine cones being the fruit in the sense of an evergreen. And so therefore it's in a sense, it's being shed off, sort of like semen. And so there's this sort of connection in that sense. But I have to ask, just because people had asked that before, it just struck me, and I'm sorry I have to ask this question, but if they're trying to design things exactly as they were in Khorsabad, which obviously they weren't, because they were moving things around, right? And the other piece of that is they were interested because these excavations were happening at the same time,
right?
And if it was Samson Tire Factory, of course, the thing in my mind is, were there any excavations happening in Israel at the exact same time? Because if there were, if there were anything even close to it, then you would assume they would be going towards that, but they weren't. So they, did people just simply not have a sense of it? Or as you said, was it just so orientalized that they just combined all these into one and just sort of went with it?
Yes, that's a great question. There wasn't as many expeditions, especially not large ones, happening in Israel at the time. But I really think it falls back into this whole sense of orientalization. It's all over there. It's all other. It's all close together. I mean, when you think about how relatively close these cultures are, I think that's what it goes back to. And these designs, I mean, when they saw these designs of Khorsabad and the Lamassu and the Genie, I mean, that is overwhelming. So obviously you can see where they got that from.
Thank you. Is there any indication or historical documentation that the original tire company, the Samson Tire Company owner, wanted / requested an Assyrian themed factory?
Not that I know of, and I have not been able to research that much on this. I really honestly don't know if it was the architects that came up with the idea and presented that to him, or he said, oh, give me an Assyrian design. My instinct tells me that he said, I want a tire factory. I want Samson Tire Factory. I want this symbol of strength. And that the architect said, hey, what about this? So that's what I think how it happened. But I don't know, and I'm just guessing. And I still need to do a little more research on that and find out.
Okay, so this question is from a student. I'm a first-year college student interested in declaring a major in ancient Assyrian culture and history.
Yay.
Would you please tell me about your career paths, and also do you have any recommendations for me?
Sargon, you start that one, and then I'll answer.
Oh God, I'm probably the wrong person to ask about that one. Well, I mean, the thing I'd love to say, God, pre-COVID, I would have said, follow your heart. Post-COVID, or not even post-COVID, midst of COVID, I don't know what I would say these days. I mean, you have to find a place you're comfortable, I would suggest, and find people that you want to work with, and people that are willing to not simply sort of mold you, which typically a lot of professors like do, especially in the ancient world, but classicists do this a lot. But I would say that find a place where you feel comfortable, someone's work that speaks to you. I mean, if I had known, if Julye was around and had graduate students when I was a student, I would have flocked to where Julye was, because I did not realize how much amazing pop culture connections she was doing. And I think these things are extremely fascinating, because you always wonder what's in the back, in the sort of the psychology of people's minds when they're bringing these things up. How are they connected in these senses? But I couldn't say more than that. I would just say sort of look to find a place you would be comfortable, and also people you would like to work with. What type of scholarship seems to be speaking to you, and then go speak to those people, send them an email and ask them, say, I'm interested in your work. What do you suggest? Do you have space as a graduate student, etc.?
Exactly. I would say the same thing. I always tell students, follow your passion, follow your heart, study what you love. When you're in college, this is your time to do that, but also to be realistic, find somebody that's work that you're really interested in. If you decide to pursue it in graduate studies, also realize that you might study a very narrow little area of scholarship, but by the time, if you decide you want to teach and you get into the teaching world, as Sargon and I are doing, we both teach classes that have nothing to do with what we wrote our dissertations on. So think broadly about that, because I would probably never be teaching if I were teaching just exactly what I studied in grad school.
Okay, thank you. We'll ask a few more questions. I know there's a lot, and thank you again to the audience who asked so many questions. So because Greco-Roman architecture is so widespread across the world and people do not claim cultural appropriation, is there perhaps a way to preserve and continue Mesopotamian-inspired architecture without being culturally appropriated? Perhaps by making the architecture not an amalgamation, but specific to certain cultures.
Want me to take that one? Yes. That is a very good point. However, there are starting to be hints of people looking at, Greco-Roman culture as cultural appropriation. I think because you always, and I'm using East and West in quotes because I don't think that way, but people always think Greco-Roman stuff, that's the West, and that's what we developed into. So it's not really appropriation because it's part of our past, where anything East, which they would include, anything in Mesopotamia or that they would think of that as appropriation. So I do think there's ways to go ahead and do that. And as we said earlier, and as Sargon was saying earlier, having the story told, what these things mean from people who are today Assyrians of that culture, So Sargon, I know we all both have enough work to do, but we should make the suggestion to the Citadel that we will write these explanations for them.
Sure. No, I think it's amazing. And there's a question later. I know, Alexandra, that you were going to ask this, but I can throw it in here. Matthias was asking from Argentina about something similar, sort of this idea of reception studies. That there's a classic reception study since the 1990s. There's an actual network. And there's more work on the ancient Near East, but this is a field very little systematized. What do you think on this emerging field?
Oh, I think it's a great emerging field, and I have a book on my desk that's relatively new. You all should read it. Receptions of the ancient Near East and popular culture and beyond. People have written about this. There's nothing really about the Citadel in here, but this is a result of these type of studies that are happening in the academic world.
And I think there was something that I came across recently that some folks may find interesting. For those people who know the work of Assyrian writer David Barsom Perley. David Perley, I found letters from David Perley recently from the Mara archive that he was writing back and forth to one of the daughters of one of the missionaries in the Urmia region, who had come to the United States at the time. And I forget exactly whose daughter it was. I'll have to check that. But in his query, he addressed her and said, in your book that you just wrote, you talked about being amongst my people and my people being the Syrians. And why did you say that? Because, we're Assyrian. It was really interesting to read your book, but I wish you could, say a little bit more about that. And it was interesting because her response was, I understand that. And I live in the Central Valley right now in Modesto, Turlock and Sears. And there's a great many Assyrians in this particular area. To be honest, I use the term Syrian because that's what we called them in English while I was there. So she was referring to what the Protestant missionaries were utilizing. And then she said, because in my mind, and this is where we get into the psychology piece of appropriation, or at least the idea of what it elicits in people's minds, whether positive or negative. And she said, in my mind, when I think of Assyrian, I think of, and she mentions, she doesn't say that she doesn't say who it is, but she says, it reminds me of this wolf, the Assyrians being wolves and the fold. And of course, she's talking about Lord Byron's poem, right? And so there's this interesting thing that I'm reading these letters back and forth, and I'm thinking, yes, it's fascinating. I mean, because things can be appropriated and utilized and utilized for the benefit of somebody, and they can be taken in a very negative way. And I think that's a lot of times what we've ended up, those of us who work on the Assyrians, both in the ancient world, but also in the modern world, we see sort of that negativity that pops up because of people like Byron, who maybe somebody read that poem. And so that immediate response is a negative response. Whereas perhaps in this particular case, there was no, I think if there was a negative connotation that the builder had towards the Assyrians, they probably wouldn't have built a Dur Sharokin, right? They probably would have built something totally, maybe they would have went with a classical style if they felt that strongly about it. But I mean, it's interesting because you do see people having that sort of negative reaction, like, oh, that sounds like something that that wouldn't be very appropriate, right? In this case, it seems like it was. So I don't know really where to go with that, but it's that particular issue of reception and how things are done is very interesting.
Okay, two more questions. So a suggestion to Julie, you mentioned that you take your students on a trip to the Citadel Outlets. Do you actually prepare any brief pamphlets about the Assyrian history and the Lamassus or anything of that nature?
Oh, yes. We were studying all that in class. We're studying the mythology, the architect. So they're pretty well steeped in it by the time we get there. And I don't usually schedule the field trip until very close to the end of the semester. So they know all about it, and they run around and they find all these different things and they understand it. And now, obviously, I'll have them watch the webinar.
Perfect. And Julie, would it be possible for the audience to get a copy of this wonderful presentation? This is a question coming from the audience member.
Yes, I will go ahead and send it to you. And I believe there will be an article coming out shortly on this, so I can also send that to you when it's out.
Wonderful. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up because we're over by 15 minutes. But we reached the end of this webinar, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who joined us here today. In addition, I want to especially thank our speakers, our wonderful speakers, Dr. Julye Bidmead and Dr. Sargon Donabed, for their contribution to preserving Assyrian culture, heritage through their academic research and bringing attention to the Citadel Outlets as well. Before you go, we encourage you to subscribe to our email list on our website and to follow us on social media using the tag @Assyrian Studies. And just to stay informed about upcoming webinars, events, grant opportunities for academics, authors, and scholars, and for ways you can support our programs. And thank you so much. And Julie and Sargon, I don't know if you have any last minute things you wanted to mention or say.
Well, I'm happy, to answer any questions later on. You can write to Alexandria and she can send you my email, and I'm very happy to be in correspondence with you.
I just want to say the same thing. Thank you so much, Julie. I just wanted everyone to know I'm just around for the ride with Julie's work, because I think there's a ton of work that needs to be done on this type of popular culture. And as Julie said, there's a lot of places around, even in the United States, in public buildings where you see this type of stuff. So there's a lot of research that can be done and should be done. And I'm so excited that Julie's doing it. I would certainly encourage anyone that's interested to take a look at that. And we're, I think, really waiting for the article to come out. I think hopefully with, well, we won't say where, right? But
we won't say where, and I haven't heard yet, but it'll come out somewhere. So
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Julie.